Hi. Thank you for having us. We're really excited to be here. Just as a quick introduction to us, my name is Morgan Parkinson. I've been at Meter close to 4 years now. Started right after finishing my master's degree. I work with most of our agricultural clients. We've been focused a lot in potatoes, but we've done a ton of stuff in tree fruit. We're here in Washington, and vineyards. But it's an area we're expanding into and trying to create a much more user-friendly interface. And so it's something that I'm really interested in. And I'll just let Leo quickly introduce himself and then I'll introduce Meter.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I recognize at least a couple names. I'm Leo Rivera. I'm a soil scientist here at Meter Group. I primarily focus on product development and mainly in our below ground sensor line. And I'm also on as the kind of the main point of contact for the STAR program project here with Steve.
Yeah, very cool. Well, let me just share a little bit about Meter Group. We were founded in 1983. We're in Pullman, Washington. And this picture up here is of Galen Campbell. So he founded the company. We're part of Campbell Scientific. So, I mean, that's where the name comes from. He is a soil physicist, worked at WSU for a really long time, just like an incredibly smart man. He still comes to the office every morning. He walks to the office every single day, and it's so impressive. But if you're interested, if you really want to dive into, all of the science behind it, he's written this book, and it's fantastic, Introduction to Environmental Biophysics. And so that's where you can learn about, all of the principles of how our sensors work. And anyway, really, really cool. We were originally called Decagon Devices, but we changed our name in 2017. So if you've heard of Decagon, that's us. Right now, we're focused really heavily in environmental research and commercial agriculture. Everything is designed, developed, manufactured at our factory here in Pullman, Washington. We're really steeped in soil science. So we have, a bunch of people with master's degrees and PhDs in soil physics, and we've got a lot of engineering expertise. We're really trying to focus on having really rugged, reliable instrumentation that you can deploy really fast and is simple to operate. So plug and play. That's kind of where we are in the market. We also want to be fairly reasonably priced for scientific grade instrumentation. We've got a lot of extensive partnerships with ag clients and big consulting firms. And let me just put a plug in right here. If you have any questions as I'm going through, please just feel free to raise your hand, or probably even better, just speak up and ask. But with that kind of background, I wanted to share a few of the instruments that I commonly suggest for our agriculture clients. The first one is our all-in-one weather station. So this is the Atmos 41. It's our second generation. And so there's actually a lot of improvements that have been made. It goes up to 60 meters per second, which is that's one of the big improvements that is with the Gen 2, but it measures precip, air temp, vapor pressure, relative humidity, wind speed, gusts, solar radiation. It's really cool. I mean, it's all in this really compact design that you can just put it, on a pole, connect it to your data logger, and it'll do all of that for you. But I mean, I think probably the most important for agriculture is this localized reference ET. So, I mean, we get a lot of people, we've had a lot of comparisons with different ET networks to kind of a localized one. And we've seen some huge differences with growers when they're using ET that's actually, in their fields. You also can get growing degree days, which is pretty helpful as well for all of your crop models. So we really, really love this weather station. I'm a huge fan of it. The other one, and I won't talk about this too much because I'm going to leave this to Leo, but like number one that I recommend beyond water content sensors is a water potential sensor. And Leo's going to dive into the science a little bit more later on, but I wanted to just mention it here because it's so important. What I've heard from Liz that most people have is the water content sensors from either a Teros 10, 11, or 12, which is, that little guy at the bottom. We've also made what is we call the Teros 54, which is just a profile sensor. So you essentially have measurements at all these different depths, and you have 4 measurements, 6, 12, 18, and 24 inches. And you've got them all the different depths. It's easy to install, easy to remove. And so it is much simpler. So if you have kind of custom depth requirements that you want, we recommend, you still use a Teros 10, 11, or 12. But if you can just do these 4 depths, this one is much easier to install and you get a better idea of what's going on in the profile. I find for most growers, it's really helpful to see if you're pushing nutrients down past the root zone. But of course, that depends on what your crop is, because, if you have, roots that are going past 2 feet, then you're going to struggle with that. And you may want something that can go a little deeper, like the more customized Teros 10, 11, or 12. I wanted to just give an example of what this would look like on Zentra Cloud, which is the platform that we're using. I'm not sure if you guys are looking at Zentra Cloud or if you're pulling it. Okay, you are. So this is what normally I'm looking at, and this is how I'm setting up my charts, but we've got a bunch of different axes. And I mean, that's the wonderful thing about Zentra Cloud, right? Is that you can customize it to see, whatever you or your grower is interested in. But for me, this is in potatoes. And I was looking at the comfort zone. And again, Leah will go more into this, but the comfort zone for potatoes, as far as matrix potential is concerned, is from -20 to -60 kPa. That's where, it's going to be best, and where you want to keep your water. And so I highlighted this green to show, okay, I want these traces of my 6-inch matrix potential and my 12-inch matrix potential. I want them to be in that green zone. And you can tell that because these traces are above, right, they're, closer to the 0 to -10, that we're wet right here. And so that's like a really easy way for me to be able to check and say, okay, how am I doing with my soil moisture? I also have my volumetric water content sensors, and that's that brown and that kind of orange color right here that I'm looking at as well. And I'll talk a little bit later on about, and Leo will as well, about why we want both water content and matrix potential. But you can watch both of those at the same time. I have right here is my irrigation or my precip. So, and I probably should have put this in here, but we have a rain gauge that sometimes I'll put under the pivots if I'm, in a cropping system that has pivots. But you can also use you're in uh, if you're in a vineyard or an orchard and you've got kind of higher sprinklers, you can use the Atmos 41 because it has that rain gauge as well. But I'm looking at right here, my irrigation and precip, and also at the same time, my reference ET. And it's another really good check to say, okay, my irrigation, and this is total, you can change the totals, but this is a total for, I think, a week. And you can say, okay, how is my irrigation doing compared to my reference ET? And you can see that, right here, it's a little bit low. So you say, okay, well, maybe we need to irrigate a little bit more. And you can also double check, with your soil moisture sensors to see how you're doing as well. There are other sensors that I'll talk about that you can add in here, but I really like this setup for a nice check to see, atmospherically, how are we doing with our ET and how are we doing with our soil moisture. Other sensors that you can use, this is a canopy or surface temperature sensor. It's made by Apogee, but it integrates into our data loggers really well. So it's an infrared thermometer. And the reason that you'd want to put this in is to measure crop stress. So you point this at your canopy, and if your canopy is hotter than the air temp, you'd also want to pair it with an air temp sensor that's, in your canopy. And if your canopy temperature is hotter than your air temp, then you know that your plant is experiencing stress. And there's a whole model for this that we can get more into, and I'm happy to answer questions about. But it's a really cool way. I mean, it's all of these kind of checks and balances, right? Where you have, how is my ET matching with my precip? And you can say, okay, well, I'm also going to check my soil moisture and how is that doing? And this is one that's, actually measuring the crop. And so when you have those three together, your crop indexes, your soil moisture, your atmospheric, it's a really, really powerful tool. And that's one of the things, I mean, without hopefully giving away too much that I'm not supposed to be, that's one of the things that we're working on in development right now, is how do we use these three things and integrate them to come at, a number that is perfect of, how much do I actually need to irrigate? So hopefully look for that in the next couple years, hopefully not before too long. Another one that we see is this leaf wetness sensor. So it's this white sensor. It looks just like a leaf, and it will just tell you when it's wet outside, when your leaf will be wet. So we see this a lot when people are just trying to figure out if there's going to be diseases. I saw it in orchards quite a bit, and there are obviously models that are helpful here that you can look at disease models using this leaf wetness sensor, which are really cool. Solar radiation, this is another one that we integrate from Apogee, but we'll plug right into our data logger. This one will measure total solar radiation. We have solar radiation on the all-in-one weather station, but if you just wanted that and you didn't need any of the other parameters, this one is a great one. We also have photosynthetically active radiation, another light sensor from Apogee. They're kind of the leader in these light sensors. This one I've seen farmers use. I mean, obviously it's important to know how much PAR or photosynthetically active radiation your plant is getting. But I see it when there's like a lot of smoke and people are wondering, okay, how much, sunlight is my plant actually getting through this smoke? Just one application here. And now I'm going to have Leo talk just a little bit about why water potential is the most important. I think if you're just going to add one tool, I think it should be a water potential sensor, or probably that Atmos 41 that can tell you about ET. So take it away, Leo.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about water potential, and I don't want to assume that everyone knows a lot about water potential here, which you may, but when we think about water content or water in soil, there's two sides of the story. There's the water content, which is the amount of water that's present in the soil, and then there's the water potential, which is the energy state or how tightly bound the water is in soil, which really what that tells you is, of course, how available that water is for the plants. And what's cool is we can use that as a way of actually directly measuring if we're in the correct comfort zone for our plants. And so we see a chart here on the right that shows some different comfort zones in terms of water potential for a variety of different plants, including strawberries, potatoes, like Morgan was talking about earlier, grapes, especially during different parts of the season. So there may be parts of the season where we're actually trying to purposely stress our grapes for sugar production and things like that. And so water potential is a really an awesome tool to be able to actually measure what the plant is experiencing, which can be hard to do using water content sometimes, especially as soil types change. Of course, we can know when we've achieved drought conditions, which in most of the case, we're probably not trying to achieve drought conditions for growers, but that there are cases where we want to know that. And it is essentially gives you your most basic fill and refill point. So when you get to the upper and lower thresholds of those comfort ranges for those plants. And again, like I said, the great part about water potential is it is independent of soil type, because it's actually the direct measurement that the plant is feeling. And this is really what ultimately, when we're measuring water content, what we're trying to understand is how the plant is feeling. You can go to the next slide, Morgan. So here's an example showing just some water content data versus some water potential data here on the top. And you can see that you don't see a ton of variation in the water content data, even in that later part of the season. But you do see that as you get a little bit further we actually really start to stress the plant in those last two kind of cycles where it gets really dry. And so it kind of shows you when you're in the right ranges when you have the two together. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Morgan. Yeah, so this is just kind of a closer look at that. And you look at that middle part of the graphs and you see that the water content doesn't look all that different from the last part, but there is, depending on the soil type, there is a threshold where you hit where all of a sudden the water potential drops pretty significantly. And you might miss that with just water content on its own. And so it's really, that's where the having that water potential measurement is helpful to see when you're hitting those points independent of the water content data. So I think that's it on that, Morgan.
So I just wanted to share, I think it can be really hard for some growers to wrap their head around water potential or matrix potential. It's in units that can be kind of hard to understand. And it can be hard to understand why maybe you need both water content and water potential. I usually find that, at least with the growers that I've met with, they're usually using, one of the three. They're usually, looking at ET, or they're looking at just volumetric water content, or they're just looking at matrix potential. So that would be people who are just using, tensiometers. The most classic version of water potential is just the tensiometer. And a lot of them just have like the dials on top, right? Where you can go out and look at the tensiometer and you check the dial and you can write it down. The nice thing about ours is that you can plug it in, and so you get a continuous read. And we also have tensiometers that you can connect to the data loggers, but they'll cavitate, and so you've got to refill them. And this one, they don't have quite the range that the Terrace 22 or 21 do, and so that's what's so nice. So I just wanted to share this example. We started working with someone in Grace, Idaho, and this was on a potato farm. He did potato and wheat. He had a potato wheat rotation. It was a center pivot, and he started using water potential in 2019. He had been using volumetric water content before that, but he did it in 9 fields in 2020. And I wanted to just show why why you might need both of these. And so here's a field that we were in last year. And the brown line or kind of orange line is this water content. If you were just looking at this water content line, you would see that it goes down like crazy. And if I'm the one watching this, I'd be freaking out at this point, right? I'd be saying, okay, we have got to figure something out. It's dropping like a rock. And I know that there are kind of different levels of consultants and growers. And, if you're making sure that you're calculating your volumetric water content and doing it as, you have field capacity and permanent wilting point, then you're going to do better. But I know some growers who are just looking at the trend line, right? And so if I'm just watching the trend line, then yeah, like right about here, I'm really starting to worry. But the nice thing about matrix potential is, I have this green bar again, is that comfort zone, like Leo was talking about in the previous slides. And right here, you can see that it's like completely wet. We're at 0, we're at saturation. And right here where you're, beginning to freak out because of your water content, you say, actually, we're like just getting in that comfort zone. We're going to be okay. But if you didn't have that, I think you'd really start to be worrying. This this is kind of there's a lot going on here. It's like spaghetti almost, I think. But I think it's really cool. So this is his farm, and he's got these in all these different fields, and they've got all these like really fun names, I think. But you can see, here's his volumetric. Can you guys see my mouse at the bottom? Okay, cool. So at the bottom, we've got VWC, volumetric water content, and all these lines are in different fields. But he was really worrying because, I mean, if you follow one of these lines, you don't see a lot of movement. And this is after, we've got like June 10th to July 18th. And so it's in, a fairly hot part of the year, and he's expecting to see more movement, right? But just because of his soil type, he doesn't see it a lot in volumetric water content sensors. These are the same, but the matrix potential sensors, or the Terrace 21 or 22. And there's that green line again of his comfort zone. But you can see right here, like the information that it's giving, right? That there's a lot more movement in these sensors, and you can see kind of the water availability. You can see when it's dipping down below that comfort zone, and he immediately can see, okay, based off of this, this blue and the orange and the yellow, like these, and kind of that gray, light gray, these are the fields I really need to focus on because they're really dry. This was kind of a drier year. He didn't have, normally what I see in a lot of fields is you can see like up here, there's just like lines that never leave that zero, meaning that they're overwatering a lot, but we don't see that in this one. But I find it, really useful to use these matrix potential sensors. So I just wanted to share what he found with some ROI data for him. He started using it in 2020. He reduced his water use by 38%, reduced his cost per 100 pounds of potatoes, his pumping costs, saved 13,000 on pumping costs, improved his yields. But I think maybe the most important for him is that he was able to improve the quality, and he was able to sell his potatoes for a much higher price. And I wanted to share, this is a really cool graph. So we did this research with Brian Hopkins, who is a BYU researcher. And so we're doing this, we have this collaboration with them. And not only was he just looking at the water in the field, but he was looking at nitrogen use. And this graph I think is really cool. So right here, this light gray is our yield potential. So these light gray areas are where we have low yield potential and low nitrogen. And they were able to determine yield potential, and that was just based off the soil type. The medium gray is average yield potential in nitrogen. Dark is high yield potential in nitrogen. So these are areas where, typically this was from a yield, they had a yield map from previous years. And they were able to say, okay, in these spots in the field, we always see high yield, and there's also, high levels of nitrogen. On the x-axis, these D bars are where we have deficient water. Right here, the middle is, optimal watering, and then right here is excess watering. On the y-axis, we see that, this is your relative yield increase or decrease. So, anything above here is where you're having a yield increase, and here's, where you have a yield decrease. And that, everything is based off of this average yield potential and nitrogen. So that's kind of our baseline. But I think what's most interesting about this graph is that you see that, okay, for areas where, you're not going to have a good yield potential or nitrogen, areas where you don't have enough water, when you're putting on more nitrogen, the effects are really minimized when you don't have enough water. And you see the same thing right here, right? The effects are minimized if there's too much water. And it makes sense, I think, intuitively. If there's too much water, you're flushing nutrients down past the root zone. If there's not enough water, obviously your plants aren't going to be able to get that nitrogen. This is really just driving home the point that, when you have optimal water, you also can see right here, right? This is a huge increase. When you can add the nitrogen, you're getting a huge yield increase, but you only see that when, you're watering optimally. And so I think this just drives home the point. A lot of farmers are saying, well, it doesn't hurt too much, if I'm overwatering, I just want to be really careful to not underwater, because, everyone knows you lose a ton of yield when you underwater. But right here, you can say, okay, actually you are losing a lot because you're not seeing the effects from your fertilizer. And so I think it's maybe a more compelling argument as to why you might want to water more efficiently. I know in Colorado, you probably have some pretty compelling arguments to water efficiently, maybe more than Idaho anyway, but this was just another really cool example, I thought. So right here, 2019 is when he started putting these in. 2020 is when he started using them. And we just see, pumping costs went down, average yield went up per acre compared to these other years. Cost of water per 100 pounds of potatoes went down. And I know what everyone's thinking right now, which is, okay, but how are you comparing across years when water is going to be very different across years? So we also measured this total reference CT, and from 2019 to 2020, and it's a little bit below 2017 and 2018, but not by much, right? It wasn't that much drier of a year, so you can attribute these cost savings to him watering the most efficiently. And now I'll let Leo talk just a little bit more about water potential. Let me ask really quick first. Are there any questions about that?
Okay. Yeah, and feel free to interrupt if you do any questions do crop up on that. But and we will most likely have time at the end as well for questions. But I will spend a little bit of time on this slide. It's mostly because this is an area that we've spent a lot of our time here working on, which is trying to improve water potential measurements. And I think one of the reasons that people measure water content more than anything else is because it's way easier to measure than water potential. And one of our goals as a company, and this is, I mean, I've spent a lot of my time on here, but I think if you count the people before me that have spent time working on this technology, it's probably over 30 years of effort to try and develop better technology to measure water potential in the soil. And so the fruits of that work are these two sensors right here right now. So we have two sensors currently available for measuring water potential outside of the traditional tensiometers that we also have. It's the Teros 21 Gen 2 and the Teros 22. The Teros 21 is a sensor that's actually been around since the late 2000s, maybe early 2010-ish. But it's also something we've been iterating on ever since, trying to make better. And that's kind of where the Gen 2 came out of, was out of base on the efforts to improve that sensor. And it's the one that's on the upper right with the circular looking disc. And so this one's used quite a bit in research. Both of these sensors measure water potential essentially from near saturation to air dry, so 0 to minus 100,000 kPa. So they really cover a pretty broad range of water potential, and they are specifically optimized to measure in the plan available range of water potential. The Teros 22 is a newer version of that sensor, and you can see that it has a different looking form factor than the Teros 21. And the reason for that is the Teros 21 has always been a bit of a challenge to install. Anybody who's ever installed the Teros 21 knows that it takes a little more prep work, and especially if you're trying to install at different depths, can be challenging. Now we've come out with some different tools to make that a little bit easier with this borehole installation tool that we have available now. But when you're working in a field and you need to pull sensors out as well, that's not really optimal. And so that's when we were developing the Teros 22, one of the goals is that we could make it easy to install and also easy to remove at the end of the season if needed. And that's kind of where that form factor came out of. So now with the Teros 22, it can actually be easily installed with a 5/8 inch masonry drill bit, which amazingly you can get really long masonry drill bits up to 3 or 4 feet and longer if needed. So that was a nice thing that we found out. But it really simplifies the installation experience, and you just come out, drill to the depth that you want to measure, and install the sensor by pushing it into that hole that you've drilled. And the nice thing about both of these sensors is they don't require any maintenance. And if you've ever worked with like tensiometers and anything like that, you know that they require a lot of maintenance. But they are still an amazing sensor. But for something that you want that's easy to use, these are a really nice option. And if you ever want to know how they make those measurements, let me know. I'm happy to talk about that, but I don't want to dive into that super deep today because that can get a little boring for some people. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so talked about water potential. I want to talk about this one last concept. This is something that we've spent a little more time on recently because there are becoming many important reasons to understand the salt budget, and especially in areas where salinization is becoming a big issue as well. And So when we think of salts in soil, it's really important to understand there's actually a lot of sources for salts in soil. You have salts in our irrigation water, and some areas have actually really high amounts of salt in the irrigation water. And that salt and water enters the soil from those sources. And then when the water evaporates, of course, the salt remains. We're all pretty familiar with this. Sometimes we have to flush our root zone to get some of those salts out. But it turns out this can be a really useful tool for understanding what's happening with our water and where it's going. So let's go and go to the next slide. It's also important that there are some additional sources of salt. When we apply fertilizer, some of those salts stay behind. And then we also sometimes have water and salts that flow upward from shallow water tables. And we wind up with water leaving, but salt staying. And so we can wind up with an accumulation of salts. But it turns out we can also use these measurements to help us understand what's happening with our nutrients and how they're being used, or if they're potentially leaching beyond the root zone. And one of the things that we've been working on is trying to improve our ability to understand what's happening in the soil and what's happening with the salts. I think go ahead and go to the next slide, Morgan. Yeah, so we've actually spent a lot of time working on tools to actually make these measurements. And one last thing I want to talk about, I didn't quite put that in the slides very well, is it turns out that we can actually use these measurements to understand drainage and what's happening in some areas is becoming more important. For example, in California with I think it's Sigma, they're needing to better understand water that's moving through the soil past the root zone and trying to better quantify drainage and groundwater recharge. And so tools like this, they're actually starting to utilize some of this stuff to better understand that. So we have a few different sets of tools right here that we use to make these measurements. We have our ES2, which is actually a water EC and temperature sensor that can be put in your irrigation line to measure the EC of the incoming water if you want to go that route. Or in some cases, we actually now have tools like the Atmos 41W and Atmos 41 Gen 2 that we can measure the EC of the precipitation coming in. So we can actually, if it's placed below a pivot like Morgan was talking about, or below the irrigation source, we can actually measure the EC of that irrigation coming in. And then we can track what's happening with that water and the salts in the soil using a sensor like the Teros 12 to measure the soil water, so that measure the pore water EC of this water in the root zone. And then if you have a sensor placed below the root zone, you can measure the pore water EC there. And we can actually quantify what's happening with the salts and what's moving beyond the root zone, especially in some cases if you do need to flush to get some of those salts out when there's too much accumulation. So it's a really nice combination of tools like this to understand what's going on. And then when we combine that all together with the ZL6, it just allows us to do all that mass balance calculations with these tools in the software and actually look at what's going on and track those changes. And we have tools in there to convert from bulk EC to pore water EC, which is a better way to actually understand what how the salts are affecting the plants and things like that. And then I think I have one last slide. Just wanted to highlight this kind of piece of technology that we've added. So Morgan talked about the Atmos 41W and the Atmos 41 Gen 2. One of the things that was a really nice piece that we added to these two instruments is the ability to measure the EC of the incoming water. And so you can see the two little electrodes right there in the Atmos 41W. And those two electrodes actually allow us to measure the EC of both precipitation and the irrigation water coming in if it's below the source. Which even in precipitation in some areas there are some salts that come with that, and so it is something that we have to that it's helpful to understand. So
And I should mention, I don't think I did a very good job of differentiating between the Atmos 41W and the Atmos 41 Gen 2. The Gen 2, so the W is right here, and you can tell it's got like a little solar panel on it. This is a really cool device because it essentially has the logger built into it. So we find that a lot of times where the soil sensors are is not the optimal place to put a weather station. And people were, saying over and over again, hey, I hate having to just have a logger for one weather station. And so wouldn't it be nice if we could just have the logger built into it? And so that's what this is. It's the same technology, but the logger is built in. But this is like fantastic because you put up a pole. I mean, it can even be like a T-post, whatever you have, and you throw this on and you press a button and then you're good. And so this is like, I think it's like the coolest thing in the world, like most easy to install weather station in the world. But there's also, I mean, if you do have a spot where you've got soil moisture sensors or other sensors and you've got a logger and you've got an extra port, you can of course, buy the other one where you just plug it into. So that's kind of the difference between those two.
Yeah. Now, and I think that's all we had to cover. You can go to that last slide. I did put our contact info in here. I put Morgan in my email address. So feel free to send us any emails if you have questions afterwards. But outside of that, thank you for taking some time to listen to us talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Any questions right now?
Morgan, I got a question for you. One of the things that we see a lot of our producers real interested is the ET thing. And so your number one recommendation would probably be to go with that Atmos. Was it the Gen 2 or does it make a difference? And then for folks who are doing that, do you also have a recommendation on where to install those and orientation of the field versus the crop?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends. So yes, I mean, that's the recommendation. If, like I said, if you've already got a logger, sometimes, well, let me say, the best place to put it is usually outside of the field, and there's, a certain height. So we're using the ET from the model is FAO 56, right? Penman Monteith. And so, we want it at 2 meters high. And usually what I do is put it right outside the field. Just because when you get it inside the field, and you're watering, you get some microclimate conditions that usually are not as representative. But, it depends on how much you're, how big of an area you're, trying to measure. I think we found, Leo, correct me if I'm wrong here, and I can send, we have, I think, a whole like webinar about this, but we found there was like a 7-mile radius. Am I getting that right? That, it was pretty representative within a 7-mile radius. And then once you got outside of that, you wanted to put another one. Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
No, that sounds right. And the only thing I would add is the main thing you want to do is avoid any for example, a large building being next to the logger or a big source of heat like concrete or asphalt or something that is a large enough object that will overheat create that heating effect that you don't want, that's not representative of the field conditions. Those are the things you want to avoid.
Yeah, but I mean, it's such a cool, powerful tool to have that localized DT. I love it. We have some like consultants who like that's all that they use is they just are putting those Atmos 41s everywhere to just look at ET in all of the different fields. So any other questions? Did that answer your question? Do you have any other follow-up ones? Okay, perfect.
What's the cost of them, of the Atmos 41?
Good question. Like, I'm not in, I started.
I'm so bad at that.
Started out in sales.
I can probably look that up really quick.
Yeah, you can look it up. I don't want to say something that's wrong right now. We'll go look it up. Other questions in the meantime. Well, but I will say so. The one that's connected to the logger is much cheaper than the one that has the logger built in. So, you know, if you have the logger built in, essentially it's going to be similar to the cost of buying them separately.
And Leo, last time we spoke, you had mentioned like through this program, since all of these producers enrolled have a data logger, that you might be able to offer like a discount if they wanted to get an additional attachment. Is that still something you think Meter could arrange?
Yeah, no, I think because of our arrangement with with Steve and with the CSU project, that we can definitely arrange something for that. And so I think if there are any inquiries on that, what you can do is just let us know that it's associated with the
Colorado
CSU Star
Soil Health
program.
Program.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And that will give us the heads up that, oh, okay, this is associated with that, and we can get you pricing. But just to give you list pricing, the Atmos 41 Gen 2 is $2,195, just for the weather station.
Awesome. Does anybody else have other questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Do you guys have just a rain gauge, just by a standalone rain gauge that plugs into a ZL6 logger?
Yeah, I realized I forgot to put that in there.
Yeah.
We have two different ones. So we have maybe I don't know. Leo, can you speak to the difference between the two? I know
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, we have two different ones, the ECRN 100 and the ECRN 50. Yeah, and the main difference is the resolution. The ECRN 100 has higher resolution than the ECRN 50, I believe.
And is it something you would just install like on top of the T-post where the logger is?
Yep, absolutely.
much.
Or nearby? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
it just has two U brackets on there that you connect to it.
Gotcha.
And I realized when I was showing that graphic of what I'm normally tracking on Central Cloud, that precip is coming from that rain gauge almost always. So usually I have the weather station just outside the fields in an area that's fairly representative. And then I have the rain gauge inside, so I can track, you know, when there was an actual rain event, and I can track what's coming off the pivot. That's also really helpful because, you know, I mean, it's just a second way to figure out what the pivot is actually putting down, which, you know, some people like just have that rain gauge in their fields.
How much do the rain gauge options cost?
Great question.
And I usually find that the ECRN 50 is what I usually put up because it's it costs a little bit less, and I see that it does a good enough job. So I always put that one out. But if you're worried about it, you know, the ECRN 100, I don't know that that's helpful, but it's got, you know, a bucket that's like about that big. And so whereas the ECRN 50 is just kind of a square little rectangle. But it usually does okay. You just have to be careful, right? It's always a little bit tricky because if you're, you know, under a pivot, you've got to make sure that it can go, you know, low enough below the drops, but also it can't get covered up by the canopy. And so sometimes that gets to be a little bit tricky, especially later on in the season.
Yeah. And the cost is the ECRN 50 is about $233 and the ECRN 100 is about $462.
Cool. Yeah, I just want to remind folks, these additional attachments are eligible expenses that producers can claim in our program. So, you know, getting the discount from Meter and then also having us be able to cost share on them might be something that you want to let your producers know about if you find that some of them are really into the data, they want to collect more data. So keep that in mind. Does anybody else have any other questions for Morgan or Leo?
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm
just wondering have you guys talked about how, like, if folks are interested in purchasing some of these, how to go about? Do they contact Meter directly? If so, who do they contact?
Yeah, I mean, most likely they would I think they can either, or it could come through you guys, Steve, if you wanted it to, if you guys just wanted to have it go through one source. But if they wanted to, they could just contact, probably either contact Morgan, and then Morgan would loop them in with
Yeah,
Mark
it doesn't matter to me. I just wondered if,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if people want to go through me, that's fine.
Oh yeah, no, it doesn't matter. But yeah, Morgan or I could help facilitate getting them in contact with the right person.
Yeah, I mean, if you go that route, it's a little bit easier to get everyone on the same page, so we can loop them in and, you know, make sure that they get all the discounts and that they understand. But they can also fill out a form if they want online, you know, go through the normal way and put in the comments, you know, that they're associated with the program, and they'll get in contact with the right person that way too.
I think we'd be more than happy here at CDA to help facilitate that. So if you guys have producers who want these things, let us know what you want, and we'll work together with Steve and Leo and Morgan and help facilitate that.
Sounds good, Joe.
And Morgan and Leo, I guess just one other thing would be, I think it'd be really valuable for us to continue to provide feedback to you guys. And so we get a lot of that from our folks and our staff and our partners. And at some point, I'd like to circle back with you on some of the different things we're seeing and finding, and ways that we can continue to help you improve it for helping us.
Yes, please.
So.
No, we love that.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna ask, is it seems like there's a lot of people who are using the instruments and, you know a lot more. So as we, you know, build out a product that is more focused on, you know, commercial producers and, you know, less focused maybe on research, I would love to hear feedback. And please, I mean, if you're willing to meet with me directly, please, you know, send me an email, or if you know any producers that would be willing to meet with me, so I could just ask them about their experience or what they would like to see, or other sensors, you know, you'd like, please email me, and I'd be happy to reach out. Most of my time is spent doing market research for this, for ag, so it'd be hugely beneficial.
It seems like our high country Rocky Mountain elk down here in Colorado are a little more keen on messing up your stations and doing all sorts of things. So we've seen some pretty funky things lately.
That's kind
Anyway,
of fun.
we'll
Send
talk some
pictures.
more. Yeah, we can talk some more. We got folks running around, and we'll collect some info and pass it on to you guys. So thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you today, though.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Awesome. So if there are no other questions, we will send Leo and Morgan's contact in our usual follow-up email. So feel free to reach out directly to them, or, you know, work through us and CSU with Steve for whatever your needs are. Yeah, I just want to remind folks that we are back on our 2-week cadence. So the info session we had last week was to make up for Labor Day, but we're back on track for our 2-week cadence. So there's no info session next week. The next one will be September 30th. So if there are no other questions for Leo or Morgan, or for me or John, I think we can end it here. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time.
Okay, thank you guys.